Hi, Stephen Hand from Staccato in Hobart. Today I want to talk about the origins of the lunge, the movement in fencing where you step forward rapidly with your front foot in attack while keeping your rear foot anchored. If you believe older histories of fencing, the lunge arose in the 16th century through authors like Agrippa and Vigiani, before being perfected in the early 17th century by rapier fencing masters Gigante and Capoferro. In his book, Schools and Masters of Fence from the Middle Ages to the 18th Century, first published in 1885, Egerton Castle first mentions the lunge in his discussion of Agrippa, whose treatise was published in 1553. One would think that this series of positions might have suggested to his analytical mind some better kind of lunge as a complement. However, the invention of the development was reserved for a later period, and that's on page 47. He goes on to discuss later 16th century developments, and he specifically talks about Vigiani's treatise of 1575, although that treatise was published 15 years after Vigiani's death, and so the techniques obviously date to no later than 1560. And Castle writes, Vigiani's work is worthy of attention, as it professes to be original, and indeed contains some indications of the new school, namely that in which passing tends to be replaced by the lunge. Agrippa had already foreshadowed the theoretical advantage of that mode of progression, but his system was not sufficiently well defined to upset the apparently more natural habit of passing right and left. Unfortunately for his glory as a fence master, Vigiani was not bold enough in his innovations to apply the principles of his celebrated punta sopra mano to all attacks, so that after all he remains one of the followers of Marozzo, instead of being the founder of the modern school, an honour which was reserved for Gigante and Capoferro, and that's from pages 61 to 62. This famous punta sopra mano, Castle goes on to write, which contains the first perfectly clear indication of a lunge, is a favourite botta, or Italian for attack, with Vigiani, who performs it from all those guards he calls perfect. When thou shalt have a mind to deliver a punta sopra mano, see that the right foot advance one great step, and immediately let thy left arm fall, and let the right shoulder at the same time press the arm forwards, dropping the point slightly downwards from above, and aiming the while at my chest, without in any way turning the hand. Push thy point as far as ever thou canst, and that's from page 66. Now, if we dismiss the flawed view that Castle has of the development of swordsmanship being some sort of evolutionary progression in the very primitive understanding of what evolution is, from primitive early swordplay to the perfection of what he evidently sees as our enlightened modern age, what Castle is saying is that while the punta sopra mano was probably a lunge, although we don't have any images of it, the fact that Vigiani still used other types of footwork and attack precludes him from getting the title of father of the lunge. Castle goes on to write, to Nicoletto Gigante belongs the honour of having first clearly explained the advantages of the lunge and applied it to most attacks. It is true that Capoferro, who was contemporary with him, explained its mechanism still more carefully, but Gigante's work certainly has the priority of date. The first plate of his Teatro represents a man in the act of tirare una staccata longa, and whose position does not differ very materially from a correct lunge in our days. That's on page 106. So, according to Castle, Gigante almost perfected the lunge, and Capoferro went that last little bit and made it perfect. So, hurrah for them. Now, Castle's ideas have lasted a long time. Almost a century later, writing in 1971, Arthur Wise, in his History and Art of Personal Combat, fairly slavishly followed Castle's lead, and he wrote, where Agrippa had talked of thrusting from the shoulder, Vigiani develops this idea into the lunge. The punta sopra mano, as he calls his version of the lunge, is delivered by advancing the right foot with the sword arm fully extended at the opponent's chest, at the same time counterbalancing this movement forward by lowering the left arm backwards. Even in the 18th century, the movement had hardly developed beyond this point, and that's from page 44. Now, having effectively said that Viggiani invented the lunge, he rather contradicts himself on page 74 by writing, "But despite the work of Agrippa, which at least suggested the lunge, Fabris did not invent that vital movement. The first fully worked out description of the movement and of the essential recovery from it belongs to Giganti. Giganti describes the lunge, the method of delivering the point by the shortest and fastest means, and the recovery from it." So, the accepted wisdom has always been that Agrippa hinted at the lunge, while Viggiani probably used it but didn't illustrate it, so we can't be 100% sure. And besides, he still used lots of those nasty primitive passes. And then finally Giganti and Capoferro came along and showed us the one true way. They fully developed the lunge as we know it, and hurrah for them, don't we love them. Which all sounds fine, except that it's bollocks. Now, quite apart from the fact that people like Mayer were clearly lunging, Castle says that Mayer's lunge is, to quote him, imperfect, and just a copy of Viggiani, which is highly unlikely. It's always struck me that the idea of making a long step forward in attack is hardly rocket science. I've seen a great number of students who just do it. Even in systems without lunging, they will naturally just step that little bit forward and do something that looks remarkably like a lunge, if not is actually a modern fencing lunge. So consequently, I've for quite some time now been on the lookout for earlier images of the lunge than from the 16th and 17th centuries, and I was right. Now, I was expecting to find earlier examples of lunges in medieval art and to maybe push its origin back a couple of hundred years. I didn't expect to push the origins of the lunge back 1700 years. Yep, that's right, 1700 years, back to the 1st century BC. Recently, I've been expanding the work on shields that Paul Wagner and I started in the latter part of the 20th century to include a range of different shield types from across time. And as part of this, I've been looking at a lot of images of Romans, and particularly images of which there are a great number of gladiatorial combat. Now imagine my surprise when I looked at an image from the 1st century BC and saw a lunge. A gladiator is lunging forward with his shield leg, that's the left leg, and extending his shield either as a defence or to strike at his opponent's shield or legs. But the amazing thing about this image is that it isn't just a lunge, it's a perfect Giganti lunge. If you don't believe me, look at this comparison. The back leg is completely straight. The torso is sloped forward in line with the angle of the back leg. The knee is exactly over the front toe, whereas if you look closely, Giganti's knee is slightly forward of the front toe, something that modern fencers would caution us against, as it can increase the chance of injury. Specifically, I want you to look at the following two angles which I've highlighted. In both images, the back leg and the torso are in a straight line that ends in the right armpit. Also, if you draw a straight line up the back of the front calf, it ends in the armpit, and that's actually something that occurs in just about every lunge that, every correct lunge that I've seen, regardless of period. And in fact, there's less difference between Giganti's lunge and the Roman example than there is between Giganti and a modern lunge. If we compare Giganti and the Roman lunge to the perfect, and I say that in inverted commas, modern foil lunge of Aldo Nardi, a lot of people say that his lunge was the best there was. We can see that the torso is held at a very different angle in the modern lunge, and it is not in line with the angle of the back leg. Now, since I've found this image, the image of the gladiator lunging, I've been on the lookout for more, and I've been able to find them. Here are two more images of gladiators in what can only be described as lunge positions. Now the first is, you could argue, is not really a lunge, because the secutor gladiator on the right is advancing up a ramp against the retiarius above him and is doing a lunging step, which you could argue is not a lunge in the proper sense, but is merely a way to get up a sloped surface efficiently while protecting yourself. The second image is clearer. Both gladiators are clearly lunging forward. Now, when we think about it, what is odd here is not the fact that Roman gladiators are lunging nearly 2,000 years before previously accepted wisdom suggests that the lunge was invented. What is weird is that we ever believed that the idea that the lunge was an advanced technique that it took centuries to develop. It's a big step forward. The idea that no one in the history of combat thought to make a big step forward before the 16th century is, when you think about it, a pretty bizarre idea. People experiment, in training at least, and will do what works. In some combat systems, lunges work really well. In others, they're not so appropriate, and so it's not a surprise that we don't see them. So, who invented the lunge? Well, it wasn't Gigante in 1606, or Vigiani in 1560, or even Agrippa in 1553. And it probably wasn't even some Roman gladiator 2,000 years ago. No, the lunge was probably invented thousands of different times, every time someone decided that just that little bit bigger step would let them reach their opponent. So, the inventor of the lunge? Probably a caveman called Og trying to stick a spear deeper into the side of a mammoth. Thanks for watching.